And then what starts to happen in jiu-jitsu is the motor unit recruitment skyrockets because your body experiences what's called an alarm reaction response. If we walk so much, we can actually move into faulty biomechanics. The sweating will come from the anterior portion of the hypothalamus. There's a video of Brock Lesnar training, and he talks about how I sweat profusely. And
I sweat profusely.
What's up, everybody? It is Hopper. We're back at it here with a reaction segment to this video titled "The Exercise Truth That No One Wants to Hear." The channel is Dr. Liberman's Evolution. I came across this video the other day, and I have seen some of this video, and it's got some interesting points to discuss, especially from my viewpoint of wrestling and jiu-jitsu and combat sports. So without any further unnecessary pleasantries, well, let's get it started.
Most of us believe that if we just had more discipline, we would exercise more. We tell ourselves we are lazy, unmotivated, or lacking willpower. But the real truth is far more surprising. The struggle you feel around exercise is not a personal failure. It is part of your evolutionary legacy. Today, we live in a world where sitting is normal, movement is optional, and structured workouts feel like a chore we have to force into our schedules. At the same time,
Exercise is a luxury. And there's many people out there that physically cannot participate in certain activities like running or squatting with a barbell or a power clean or wrestling and jiu-jitsu. And I would argue that this type of mindset is damaging. And yeah, we need to view exercise as the luxury that it is, because it hurts worse not to do it.
We're constantly told that if we do not exercise enough, we are harming our health. That creates a quiet psychological conflict. We know movement is good for us, yet we resist it. And many people end up blaming themselves. But what if that resistance is not a flaw? What if it is actually a deeply ingrained survival instinct? Here is the part most people never hear. For most of human history, unnecessary physical effort could be dangerous. Energy was limited. Food was not guaranteed. Our ancestors had to walk long distances, carry loads, dig, climb, and sometimes run. But they did those things because they had to survive, not because they wanted to burn calories. So the human body evolved to be very careful about when it spends energy. In other words, your brain is designed to avoid effort that does not have an immediate payoff. From an evolutionary...
Well, yes, our bodies will find the path of least resistance constantly. And that is why when you start to exercise, initially you will burn more calories. If you're brand new to any sort of exercise or weight training, we burn significantly more calories during the workout because your nervous system has not adapted to the movements that you have just started. So if you started to run track or cross country or any sort of gymnastics, any sort of new stimulus to the nervous system, like jiu-jitsu, which is why jiu-jitsu is so tiring and so exhausting when you first start to do it, because your nervous system hasn't figured it out. And then what starts to happen in jiu-jitsu is the motor unit recruitment skyrockets because your body experiences what's called an alarm reaction response. And because that stimulus is so new, you just resort to using excess muscular tension. Over time, jiu-jitsu gets easier, your body starts to learn the movements, and it becomes more efficient.
perspective, that was a smart strategy. It helped our ancestors stay alive in unpredictable environments. So when you feel a strong urge to skip a workout, you are not broken. You are responding exactly the way a well-designed ancient body would. So this raises an important question. If we evolved to conserve energy whenever possible, why are we now told that we must deliberately exercise just to stay healthy? And why does modern life seem to demand a kind of movement that feels...
Conserving energy is far different when we need it. It is far different than actually needing to exercise. They're both needs. If we need to conserve energy to hunt for food, well, sure, but then of course we have found out that needing to participate in a structured resistance training program or regular exercise, of course, has its benefits as well.
So unnatural to us. To answer that, we have to look at the mismatch between the world our bodies were shaped for and the world we live in today. And once you see that mismatch clearly, the entire conversation about exercise begins to change. To understand why exercise feels so complicated today, we have to step back and look carefully at the environments in which the human body evolved. The story does not begin with treadmills or sports. It begins deep in our evolutionary past, long before cities, offices, or even agriculture existed. For more than 2 million years, our ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers. Their world was physically demanding, but not in a structured or artificial way. They did not separate movement from life. There was no concept of working out. Physical activity was simply part of surviving from one day to the next. On a typical day...
Again, we have found that working out regularly does have numerous benefits. And so moving to survive implies that the benefits from exercise are indirect. And then now we have found that if you obviously participate in a form of structured resistance training or exercise programs, that now those benefits become direct.
Today, our ancestors might have walked several miles in search of food, water, or better shelter. They gathered fruits, nuts, and roots. They dug into the ground with simple tools. They climbed over rocks, crossed uneven terrain, and navigated forests or open grasslands. When opportunities arose, they hunted animals, which sometimes required bursts of running, throwing, or coordinated group effort. At other times, they fished, set traps, or processed food, all of which required steady hand and body work. From a physiological perspective, this lifestyle created a pattern of movement that was varied, functional, and spread across the entire day. Some days were more active than others. There were periods of intense effort, but they were usually brief and tied to immediate needs, such as capturing prey or escaping danger. Most movement was moderate and sustained, especially walking. Walking was likely the single most important form of physical activity in human evolutionary history. This constant but manageable level of movement shaped nearly every system in the body.
Right, but walking is such a low intense exercise, and I detest the idea of get your 10,000 steps in per day. Well, save the energy from walking and go hit the gym. You're going to get so much more benefit from a structured resistance training program like a back squat and a deadlift than you would just with walking. And I'll put some charts and diagrams up here on this video as well, but walking actually comes from the lower third of our spine. We have walked so much that it is just nearly automatic. And if we walk so much, we can actually move into faulty biomechanics. And I've worked with numerous people where their walking gait has some sort of discrepancy or some sort of issue with the tibialis anterior or the posterior tibialis, and the calf becomes tight, and they walk several miles a day to walk their dogs or whatever it is. And excessive walking just can certainly start to harm us simply because we fall into inadequate neuromuscular pathways.
Muscles evolved to support endurance and efficiency rather than short bursts of extreme power. Our joints adapted to handle repeated loading over uneven surfaces. Our cardiovascular system developed to support long periods of steady activity. Even our balance and coordination reflect a history of moving through complex natural environments, not flat, predictable floors. But there is another equally important piece of the story. While our ancestors were physically active, they also lived under conditions where energy was limited and unpredictable. Food was not guaranteed. Some days were successful, others were not. Under these conditions, natural selection strongly favored individuals who used energy wisely. This is where the principle of energy conservation becomes central. The human body evolved to avoid wasting effort when it was not necessary. If a task did not have a clear benefit for survival or reproduction, it made sense to rest. This was not laziness, it was an adaptive strategy. Over thousands of generations, our brains and bodies became finely tuned to balance effort and reward. As a result, we inherited powerful biological signals that encourage us to conserve energy whenever possible. When we sit down instead of standing, or choose an easier path over a harder one, we are often responding to ancient mechanisms designed to keep us alive in environments where every calorie mattered. From an evolutionary perspective, these instincts were protective, so it makes perfect sense that we are not automatically drawn to strenuous, repetitive exercise for its own sake. Our ancestors did not wake up and decide to run in circles to improve their fitness. They moved because movement solved real problems. It found food, ensured safety, built shelter, and maintained social connections. When those needs were met, resting was often the wiser biological choice. This balance between necessary activity and energy conservation shaped the human body we all share today. Our bones expect regular loading to stay strong. Our muscles expect to be used in diverse ways. Our metabolism expects flexibility.
Okay, using your muscles in diverse ways, yes, but that impedes on the idea of learning a skill set. You want to learn adequate skill sets in the gym so that way we do deadlift correctly, we back squat correctly, we learn how to lunge. Even sprinting mechanics are critical. And these topics highlight the realms of exercise versus training. And training is so much more different in terms of progressive overload, learning skill sets versus just indirect exercise. And indirect exercise, it can be beneficial, but if you're going to spend the time, the 3 to 4 hours a week, the 5 hours a week, you might as well get into Jiu-Jitsu or wrestling or learn to Olympic weightlifts, activities like that.
Fluctuations in effort and recovery. But all of these systems evolved in a context where movement was inseparable from daily life, not something scheduled into a spare hour after sitting for most of the day. When we remember this evolutionary background, the modern struggle with exercise begins to look very different. It is not simply a failure of motivation or character. It is a predictable outcome of placing an ancient body designed for a physically integrated lifestyle into a modern environment where movement is optional and often disconnected from immediate purpose. Seen through this lens, our resistance to exercise is not a personal flaw. It is a reflection of how well our biology still matches the world of our ancestors, even as the world around us has changed dramatically. Now that we understand the kind of world the human body evolved in, we can begin to see just how different modern life really is. This difference is what scientists often call an evolutionary mismatch. It happens when a body adapted for one set of conditions suddenly finds itself living in another. For most of human history, physical activity was unavoidable. Today, it is largely optional. That single shift changes everything. In the modern world, we have engineered movement out of daily life. We sit to work, sit to travel, and sit to relax. Many people can go from morning to night with only short bursts of walking in between long periods of stillness. From an anthropological perspective, this level of inactivity is extremely unusual. Our ancestors simply did not have the option to remain seated for hours at a time. Chairs are a good example. They seem harmless, even helpful. But from a physiological point of view, prolonged sitting places the body in a position it was never meant to maintain for so long.
That is 100% true. I've heard the phrase sitting is the new smoking. And if you sit often and regularly, I would strongly suggest to utilize a stand-up desk. And when you use a stand-up desk, be sure you have a pad on the floor because of the equation impulse, which is force multiplied by time. And that pad on the floor will decrease the ground reaction force back up onto your body. So if you are standing throughout the majority of the day, that is better than sitting, but be mindful of the floor in which you stand on.
Our hips, spine, and muscles evolved for frequent changes in posture, not static positions. When we sit for extended periods, many of the systems that depend on regular movement begin to function less effectively. At the same time, we have changed how we move when we do move. Much of modern activity happens on flat, predictable surfaces, often in cushioned shoes that reduce sensory feedback from the ground. In contrast, our ancestors...
And if someone is new to exercise, when he was talking about flat surfaces, if you are new to exercise, eventually you do want to expose your body to variability. So if you run on a track versus sand versus concrete versus a trail, those different environments will give us excellent amount of afferent feedback to your spine to help with our balance. So that is a good concept to focus on.
Ancestors moved across varied terrain that constantly challenged balance, coordination, and the small stabilizing muscles of the feet and legs. Over time, this difference affects strength, mobility, and even how we distribute forces through the body. Another major change involves how we obtain food. For our ancestors, calories required effort. Gathering, hunting, and processing food all demanded physical work. Today, food is widely available and often requires little or no movement to acquire. From an evolutionary standpoint, this creates a mismatch between energy intake and energy expenditure. Our bodies are still wired to store excess calories in case of future scarcity, but scarcity is far less common in many modern environments. Climate is another factor. Our ancestors lived outdoors and experienced natural variations in temperature. Their bodies regularly adapted to heat, cold, and weather. Today, we spend much of our time in climate-controlled buildings. While this increases comfort, it reduces the small, constant physiological challenges that once helped maintain metabolic flexibility. Even the structure of our day...
So that gets into the idea of sweating, which is a negative feedback loop, and the sweating will come from the anterior portion of the hypothalamus. And if you ever run into someone that sweats profusely, they probably hike regularly or they run. There's a video of Brock Lesnar training, and he talks about how I sweat profusely and whatnot.
For me, I sweat profusely. I mean, when I start working out, I'll drop anywhere between 8 to 12 pounds.
When we're in our hardest training cycles, Brock's going to have a harder time trying to keep his weight on than he would trying to gain weight.
So I'm eating calories. I'm eating a lot of calories. I don't have to cut weight to make 265 now.
And that is your body telling itself that it's much more efficient in its cooling system. So your sensory receptors in your skin will sense the change in thermal heat because when you actin-myosin fibers, when they slide past each other, they do generate that thermal heat, and then your body senses that change in temperature, and you immediately start to sweat faster. So people that sweat faster, they're typically in better physical condition, although there's this societal construct that if he was working out and he was barely even sweating, and that's really not true. But
phase has changed. Instead of alternating between activity and rest in response to immediate needs, many of us follow rigid schedules that separate movement from the rest of life. We sit for most of the day and then try to compensate with a short session of intense exercise. From the body's perspective, this pattern is very different from the steady, varied movement it evolved to expect. All of these shifts add up. The human body is remarkably adaptable, but it still operates according to biological systems shaped in a very different world. When those systems are underused or used in unfamiliar ways, problems can arise. Muscles may weaken, joints may stiffen, and metabolic processes may become less efficient. These changes are not signs that the body is poorly designed. They are signs that the environment has changed faster than evolution can keep up. This helps explain why modern exercise can feel so unnatural. We are often trying to compress the movement our bodies expect.
I disagree with that statement, why it feels so unnatural. I mean, he would have to define what feeling natural is. And with respect to, acquiring a dopamine response, a serotonin response, getting the adrenaline to flow, accessing adrenaline into our bodies, that feels amazing. So I'm not really sure if I agree with that statement, but he would have to define that term.
Across an entire day into a short, intense session. Then we ask our ancient energy-conserving brains to cooperate with this plan, even though it does not resemble the kinds of activity patterns our ancestors experienced. So the issue is not simply that people lack discipline. It is that we are navigating a world where the default settings of daily life no longer match the biological expectations built into our bodies. Once we see exercise and inactivity through this lens of mismatch, the conversation shifts. It becomes less about blame and more about understanding the gap between our evolutionary past and our modern present. When people hear that we evolved to be physically active, they often assume that this means we are naturally wired to love exercise. But the real scientific insight is almost the opposite. We evolved to be capable of a lot of movement, but also to avoid unnecessary effort whenever possible. This idea can...
I have a difficult time with those statements in terms of how we avoid movement, because if you watch kids play, the amount of rough and tumble play that kids involve themselves in is significant. And at some point in time, as we age, that notion of play wrestling starts to minimize. It's arguably not socially acceptable. This is why that I think everyone should partake in wrestling and jiu-jitsu, because it feels so natural. And to me, defining the term natural, it feeds my limbic system. It feeds that limbic system because you protect your territory, you fight people off, and it feels incredible. So I don't really agree with that, but moving on.
This idea can seem confusing at first. How can we be built for endurance and yet resist exercise at the same time?
Well, people are lazy. Humans are innately lazy. I mean, it feels amazing to just lay in bed all day, but it also feels amazing to get up and train significantly hard and be productive.
The answer lies in understanding the difference between capacity and motivation. From a physiological standpoint, humans are exceptional endurance movers. Compared to many other mammals, we are good at walking long distances, regulating our body temperature through sweating, and sustaining moderate levels of activity for extended periods. These traits were useful in ancestral environments where finding food and resources often required persistence. But having the capacity to do something does not mean we evolved to want to do it without reason. Natural selection shaped not only our muscles and lungs, but also our brains. And the brain's primary job, from an evolutionary perspective, is to manage energy wisely. This is where energy conservation becomes central again. Throughout most of human history, expending energy without a clear benefit could be risky. If you wasted calories on unnecessary exertion, you might not have enough left when you truly needed them, such as during a hunt, a long journey, or a time of food shortage. So our brains evolved to reward effort when it served a purpose, and to discourage effort when it did not. That is why movement tied to meaning often feels different from exercise done for abstract future benefits. Chasing a child, carrying groceries, hiking toward a destination, or playing a game can feel engaging because the activity has an immediate goal. In contrast, running on a treadmill while staring at a wall can feel mentally and emotionally difficult, even if the physical movements are similar.
Well, that is true, because if you're going to train for a goal or an objective, you need to follow through with the training plan and be indifferent as to how you feel about it. You mentioned something earlier about motivation, and I detest the idea of motivation. If something is important enough to you, you will find the time and build it into your schedule. But in terms of structured training, yeah, it may not be as primitive as he suggests, but we have found so many benefits to structured resistance training programs and everything else. So moving forward.
From the brain's perspective, one has context and purpose. The other can feel like unnecessary expenditure. This helps explain a common modern experience. People say they know exercise is good for them, yet they still struggle to do it consistently. They assume this reflects a lack of discipline, but in reality, they are up against ancient neural systems that evolved to be cautious about effort with delayed rewards. Can feel mentally and emotionally difficult, even if the physical movements are similar. From the brain's perspective, One has context and purpose. The other can feel like unnecessary expenditure. This helps explain a common modern experience. People say they know exercise is good for them, yet they still struggle to do it consistently. They assume this reflects a lack of discipline, but in reality, they are up against ancient neural systems that evolved to be cautious about effort with delayed rewards.
Well, so what? I mean, who cares? There's plenty of people, Olympic athletes and whatnot, that push past this idea of trying to maintain energy for any particular need later on. And I disagree with this idea. Like, so what? Like, push past it. That's the idea of discipline. And in terms of improving your overall performance, I mean, just get it done.
Another surprising insight involves discomfort. In modern culture, we often interpret physical discomfort as a sign that something is wrong. But from an evolutionary standpoint, moderate discomfort during effort was normal. Muscles getting tired, breathing becoming heavier, and feeling warm were routine parts of survival-related activity. These sensations were not signals to stop immediately, but cues to pace oneself and continue as needed. Today, because many of us spend long periods inactive, these sensations can feel more intense or unfamiliar when we do experience them. Without regular exposure, the brain may interpret them as threats rather than normal physiological responses. This can make exercise feel more intimidating than it actually is. There is also an important insight about aging. Many people believe that physical decline with age is entirely inevitable. While aging is real, some aspects of decline may reflect long-term mismatch rather than time alone. Our ancestors remained active throughout their lives out of necessity. Their muscles, bones, and cardiovascular systems were used regularly into older age. When modern adults become increasingly sedentary over decades, some of the changes we attribute solely to aging may also be linked to underuse. All of this leads to a reframing of the exercise problem. The issue is not that humans are poorly designed for movement. In many ways, we are remarkably well adapted for it. The issue is that our motivational systems evolved for a world where movement had immediate, obvious purposes.
And again, if something is important enough to you, we don't need the motivation. I detest this idea of needing motivation for something like this.
Modern exercise often asks us to override those systems in pursuit of long-term health benefits that are harder for the brain to prioritize. Once we understand this, the inner conflict around exercise starts to make more sense. The part of you that resists a workout is not trying to sabotage your health. It is following ancient programming that once helped your ancestors survive in environments of uncertainty. Recognizing that can replace self-criticism with curiosity. So the key question becomes
that there's probably a fair amount of validity to that statement, but I would hate to think that people would use that as an excuse, like, oh, I don't want to go and train today because I need to conserve my energy. That's nonsense.
So the key question becomes not how do I force myself to exercise like a modern fitness culture expects, but rather how can I work with my evolutionary tendencies instead of constantly fighting them? That shift in perspective opens the door to a more sustainable and compassionate approach to movement, one that respects both our biological history and our current reality.
Who cares about a compassionate approach? Like, if you want to achieve an objective or a goal, you just get it done. I disagree with that statement entirely.
Once we understand that our resistance to exercise is rooted in evolution, the goal is no longer to fight our biology. The goal becomes learning how to work with it. One of the most helpful shifts is to stop thinking of movement as something separate from life. In the modern world, we often treat exercise as a special event. It is scheduled, timed, and sometimes dreaded. But for our ancestors, movement was simply woven into daily routines. They did not fit in activity. Activity was the default. So instead of asking, how can I push myself through intense workouts?
Well, it's the same thing. You can default your schedule to, these are the days that I train. There's 168 hours in 1 week, and if you want to train 3 or 4 days, then just commit to 8 to 10 hours and include your drive time in that. And yeah, it's that simple. And remove this idea of motivation and needing it to achieve anything that you want to achieve, especially if you're going into jiu-jitsu like that. Because there's going to be days in jiu-jitsu where you are exhausted, you're sore, but just go in there and just get it done regardless and work on the skill set. Who cares if you have to tap several times throughout the training session?
A more evolutionarily aligned question is, how can I make movement a normal, low-friction part of my day? This might mean walking more often, not because it burns calories, but because walking is one of the most natural human behaviors.
Yes, we previously discussed that. And excessive walking can cause faulty biomechanics and neuromuscular pathways. And the amount of times I've seen people walk and their arch starts to flatten, their ankle starts to pronate, their feet turn out, they get extreme tightness in the calves. Take that time for walking, since we've done it so much, and then go and learn new skill sets in the gym, and or go to a jiu-jitsu gym or a Thai boxing gym and learn new skill sets. And get your neurons to fire and that it's going to be so much better of a skill set to have than to just waste, all sorts of time just aimlessly walking.
It might mean carrying things, using stairs, spending more time on your feet, or engaging in hobbies that involve physical effort without feeling like formal exercise. When movement has a purpose or is tied to daily tasks, it tends to feel more sustainable. Another important reframe involves intensity.
Who cares how it feels? That's ridiculous.
Modern fitness culture often emphasizes very hard workouts, as if more effort is always better. But from an evolutionary perspective, most human activity was moderate. There were bursts of high effort, but they were occasional and usually brief.
And this reminds me of the meme that you see where it's two ancestral humans, where the meme says, if our diets are so great and we get plenty of physical exercise, then why is our lifespan only at the 35 years? And yeah, we have found, obviously, through progressive overloads, that strength training has far greater benefits than generalized passive exercise like this.
The foundation of movement was steady, manageable activity spread across the day. This does not mean intense exercise is bad. It means it does not have to be the only model. If you build a base of regular, comfortable movement, the body often responds well. Your cardiovascular system, muscles, and metabolism benefit not just from extremes, but from consistency. It is also helpful to change how we interpret the desire to rest. In modern culture, wanting to be still is often labeled as laziness. But as we have seen, the instinct to conserve energy is deeply human. Rest is not the enemy of health.
Boy, that is truer words than ever spoken. I completely agree with that. We live in a culture where we are pretty much the only animals that forego our sleep. Like if you sleep terribly one night, you can't call up to work and say, hey, I need to sleep a couple more hours. I slept terribly last night. And then you get all sorts of negative comments towards that. And you'll see, if you watch Animal Planet or any other documentary, you'll see animals just constantly sleeping. And so never avoid that sleep and get it when you can.
Problem arises when rest dominates nearly the entire day. Instead of criticizing yourself for wanting to sit, it can be more useful to gently balance rest with natural forms of movement. Environment plays a role here. Our surroundings strongly influence how much we move. If everything is designed for maximum convenience, we will naturally move less. Small changes, like placing items farther away, choosing to walk short distances, or spending time in places that invite movement, can help align our daily patterns more closely with what our bodies expect.
If you're a serious athlete, avoid that. Okay, because you need to rest, and the devil is in the details. And the more that you rest after you train for 2 to 3 hours, you don't want to do those types of activities. Like make everything efficient where you live, so that way you don't have to spend the excess energy. To the best of my knowledge, I heard that Jay Cutler lived in a house that was only one floor, so he didn't have to walk up and down stairs and burn off energy doing that.
Perhaps the most important shift is psychological. When people believe they are failing because they do not love exercise, they often feel guilt and frustration. But when they understand that their struggle reflects an evolutionary mismatch, that guilt can soften. You can begin to see your body not as an obstacle, but as an ancient system doing its best in a very new world. From this perspective, the aim is not to become a different kind of human. It is to create conditions where your existing biology can function more the way it was designed to. Movement becomes less about punishment and more about returning to patterns that feel normal at a deeper level.
Sure, that makes sense, but you want to expose your body to new movement patterns for neuroplasticity and to generate new muscular pathways. To generate new neuromuscular pathways. And it's so much better for our awareness, for our FM feedback, to learn new skill sets. Always going back to the patterns that feel normal. Yes, you want to be a master of your lifts and learn skill sets in the gym, but with respect to returning back to patterns that are so normal, like when we walk, again, we can return to faulty biomechanics, and that would be similar to not learning a new jiu-jitsu move. So be careful with that.
Your body is not broken. It is carrying instructions shaped over millions of years. Those instructions expected a life with regular, meaningful movement, balanced with rest, in a world very different from the one we live in now. When we understand that, we can approach exercise with more patience, more compassion, and a clearer sense of why it has always felt harder than we were told it should be.
Okay, there's some truth to that, why it's so difficult, and that makes sense in terms of we need to conserve energy. But I would hate to think that people would use that as an excuse to not train and to, quote, get it done. And in the words of Steve Prefontaine, he said to give anything less than your best is to sacrifice the gift. And we need to utilize our potential and optimize our potential. And to not do that seems just like a waste of time. So give this video a like and definitely subscribe for more content. I have all sorts of content on wrestling, jiu-jitsu, strength conditioning, and rehab. And we will see you all next time.